The first outlier in powerlifting, the original pound for pound king, putting up numbers so ridiculous that it took the rest of the world a decade to catch up to him. He was so strong he even broke the records in the untested. However, he also unfortunately broke himself and had to retire from the sport while still a junior. This is a story of Jesse Norris. This video was partially inspired by the following comments from Blake Clune 2958 and Tryon Strength 440. So thank you for the suggestions. Jesse Norris was someone who retired from the sport back in 2016. So a lot of newer powerlifting fans might not know who he is, but they should, because like I said, he was absolutely ridiculous. So starting off with his equipped sub-junior days. So he actually started off before IPF was raw. He was in the IPF as a sub-junior where it was only equipped. And he placed second at IPF Sub-Junior Worlds in 2009 as a 16-year-old. The following 2 years, in 2010 and 2011, he came back and he won Sub-Junior Worlds as a 17 and an 18-year-old. And these were his lifts. So here he is at 2011 hitting a 332.5 squat. Now this was in the 83 kilo class. So whilst a sub-junior, he was an 83. Then when he ended up doing what he was most known for in his raw career, he ended up being a 93. 175 bench, which bench was always the relatively weaker lift throughout his career, only because his squat and deadlift were so obscenely strong. Speaking of strong deadlift, here he is with a 320, and those were his numbers there, almost hitting a 10 times bodyweight total as a sub-junior 83. Granted, he was obviously equipped, but there you go. 2-time sub-junior world champion. Now, fun fact, he still actually holds the squat, deadlift, and total world record in the 83 sub-junior equipped category. Now, this sounds kind of more impressive than it is, because from 2011 till now, 14 years, he's held that world record. But honestly, how many 83 kilo sub-junior equipped lifters are out there nowadays? Yeah, this record is probably going to die with him. I feel like we're going to see a raw 83 sub-junior lifter break these before we see an equipped one do, because no sub-juniors lifting equipped nowadays. But then he ended up going into the raw side of powerlifting, and that's where we know him from the best. So in 2014 in February, he did his first raw meet. This was at 90 kilos. He was 20 years old at this time, and he put up what I believe was the untested world record for a 90 kilo lifter. So he had a 320 kilo squat, a 185 bench, and it's a bit hard to track down world records in the past for untested powerlifting because it's not as well chronicled, obviously, as the IPF is, because it's all different federations. But I'm pretty sure this was a world record. So 355 deadlift gave him an 860 total at a 90 kilo body weight. No wraps, just in sleeves, obviously under untested conditions. So he had a deadlift bar, he had 24-hour weigh-ins, I assume. But I believe that was an untested world record. From what I could see, I could not find anyone from that time or before who totaled more than this in the 90 kilo weight class. But then here is his legendary record, the 914 kilo total. This is what most people know Jesse Norris for. So in 2014 December, whilst being 21 years old now, he competed at a local USAPL meet, weighing in at 89.3, so in the 90 kilo class. And he put up this 340.2 kilo squat. This was done on pound plates, interestingly, hence why the weird kilo denominations. And a 200 or damn near 200 kilo bench, which I couldn't find footage of, but I found footage of his deadlift that he did of 374.2 kilos. And that's what gave him the legendary 914 kilo total. Now, this was the overall 93 kilo squat world record, which, man, it was the heaviest squat ever done by a tested 93 kilo lifter. And he held that for almost 10 years, 9.5 years he held that for. And I'll go through later in the video who ended up breaking that record. This was also the heaviest 93 kilo deadlift ever done by a tested lifter, which he ended up holding for just shy of 5 years before it was broken again by Krzysztof Wierzbicki. And this also was the 93 kilo total world record, the heaviest total ever done by a tested 93 lifter. And he held that for also 9.5 years when it was broken by the same guy who out-squatted him. Now, notably, the world record squat in the 93s, I believe, is 340 or 340.5, so it's still pretty much what he put up. And the world record deadlift in the 93s now, the IPF world record, is 373.5. So if you're comparing these to IPF world records of today, he's still pretty much got the heaviest squat and the heaviest deadlift. Obviously, there have been other 93s who, outside the IPF, have done more than him, hence why he no longer holds the overall world records. But he did hold the squat in total for just shy of a decade, and the deadlift for half a decade as well. To put into perspective how crazy a 914 kilo total is, let's look at the IPF World's winning totals in pretty much all the weight classes 93 and up. So at the time, obviously this was done at the end of 2014. So at the time, these were the IPF World's winning totals for the first 3 years when it was raw. Needless to say, Jesse Norris with his 914 would have dominated each and every single one of those years. Even the weight class up at the time when he put this up, 914, he would have won every single one of those with ease. If you look at the 120s, 2 weight classes up, guys who outweighed him by 30 kilos, at the time, a 914 kilo deadlift total still would have made him very competitive in the 120s, 2 weight classes up. In fact, it would have won him worlds the year prior, and he would have podiumed the other 2 years. And in the 120 pluses, even there, he would have won the inaugural year, which was only 2 years ago at that point in time. The sport was very young back then. This is how far ahead of his time Jesse Norris was. And he also still would have placed top 4 in all those other years. So obviously this was the early days of raw powerlifting, and from there the sport grew a lot. So if we look at the rest of the 93 kilo world's winning totals, these are the numbers, and Jesse Norris's 914 is still more than every single world's winning total we've seen from the 93s in the decades since. So he would have won every single world title with his 914 kilo total. Obviously, you know, I know there's different conditions. You have to take into account the competition on the day that was there, the international, the travel, the judging, all that. I'm just simply comparing the numbers, right? If we look a weight class up in the 105s, Jesse Norris's 914 would have continued winning worlds all the way up until 2021, which was the first year that someone in the IPF as a 105 totaled more than 914. Hell, even up until this last year, or this most recent year at Worlds, he wouldn't have finished off podium with a 914 total. Even this year, when we saw a very competitive 105 class, he still would have finished in top 4 with a 914 total. The weight class up. If we look 2 weight classes up in the 120s, there was one odd year in 2018 when he would have won it, but pretty much almost every other single year up until just the last 2, he would have podiumed in the 120s with a 914 total. And then you look at the 120 pluses, obviously here his 914 wouldn't have been as competitive, but there are still quite a few top 5 placements there even in recent years with 914. So this all just goes to show and put in perspective how far Jesse Norris was ahead of his time. He was putting up a 914 kilo total back in 2014, a full decade before any other 93 was putting up numbers anywhere near that. And you can see from the IPF World's winning numbers how long it took for 914 to become more of a regular number, particularly in the 93s and 105s, but even in the 120s. Now, if you're more of a fan of relative strength measures, this put up a 593.33 dots. That was his dot score. At the time, dots didn't even exist. They were using Wilks back then, but dots seems to be the most popular one nowadays. So this is why I say he was the first true outlier of his time, because that stood as the #1 raw male dots, amongst obviously tested lifters, for 6.5 years, until Taylor Atwood put up his legendary 838.5 at 74 and became the first guy to cross 600 dots. Now, even today, that still ranks at number 8 amongst the raw tested male powerlifters if you rank them based off of dots. And if you look at those 7 lifters who are ahead of him, the majority of those only put up those performances within the last year, right? You have like Joey B's 900 at 83, Shell's crazy 66 performance, Anthony McNaughton, what he did at 105 this year, right? And even the other ones like Perk, Rondell, Jawan, who was actually the one who broke his record, which I'll cover in more detail later, those only really occurred in the last pretty much 2 years, right? And Taylor Atwood's performance in 2021 was the only one that wasn't done within the last 2 years. So that just goes to show, again, he was so far ahead of his time, and he was the first true outlier in powerlifting, and without a doubt was pound for pound king in those first few years. So then he competed at 2015 USAPL Nationals. So this was done just a few months after he put up his legendary 914, and these were his best lifts. So he did a 310 kilo squat, a 187.5 kilo bench. So his numbers were slightly down. I believe that 310 was only his opener, and then he missed, I think, 325 twice on depth, or somewhere thereabouts on depth. So it wasn't a strength thing. And then a 352.5 deadlift. And I believe he missed I can't remember what his third attempt was, but it was a slightly bigger jump. So he totaled 850 kilos, which was 60 kilos below what he put up at that local meet, which, you know, obviously when I'm comparing that to IPF numbers, it has to be said that was done at a local meet on pound plates. Who knows if they were even calibrated or not, judging standards, all that kind of stuff. So, but still 850 at a national level with plenty of missed lifts and more in the tank on some of them. Still a crazy big performance. Now, unfortunately, here is where he failed a test. So he popped for phenylisobutylamine, or however the hell you pronounce that word, which he blamed on the pre-workout craze. Now, whether this is legit, look, I don't know. I'm not an expert on any of this, but craze has been noted to have banned ingredients in it before. So the story doesn't seem like total crap, although you always got to somewhat question it when elite athletes blame failing a test on a pre-workout, especially when they should know the implications of taking anything. But that is the reason why he didn't go to 2016 IPF Worlds. Obviously, winning 2015 USAPL Raw Nationals would have given him a ticket to Worlds in 2016, where the winning total in the 93s was 840. So Jesse Norris would have been the heavy favorite that year to win. Unfortunately, due to this, he served, I believe it was a 6-month ban, so it wasn't anything crazy long, due to the fact that it was from a pre-workout and not with any ill intentions. So he got a 6-month ban, and he was back just half a year later in the USAPL. However, in the meantime, he still held the heaviest ever untested 90 kilo total as well. So he thought, while he was banned, why not go and extend that record? So that's exactly what he did. And in 2015, in November, a few months after his failed test, he competed at an untested meet called Reebok Record Breakers, where he further extended the heaviest ever 90 kilo total. And this is in the untested category. So he squatted 347.5. bench 200. This is where he put up his best ever lifts that he had done to date, and these ended up being the best ever lifts he would have ever done. He never beat any of these numbers. And a 375 deadlift for a 922.5 kilo total. So he was 22 years old at the time, still a junior, and presumably still a tested lifter, because he still competed in the USAPL after this. Obviously, he wasn't tested at this meet. This was done on the untested conditions, so he had a 24-hour weigh-in, I assume, and deadlift bar and all that sort of stuff. But 922.5, absolutely insane. However, he returned at 2016 USAPL Nationals, so he had served his 6-month ban. He was back in the USAPL, and he was trying to punch his ticket to 2017 Worlds, which obviously he missed out on Worlds the previous year because of that failure. So he squatted 327.5. And again, I believe he attempted a 340 here, but he missed it on a depth call, which was somewhat controversial. A 160 bench. Now, notably, at this point, he was dealing with a pretty bad shoulder injury, hence why his bench numbers were down pretty significantly. And a 350 deadlift for an 837.5 total, which was a pretty tough lift. And this was actually the year where David Ricks went head-to-head with him, which was quite a clash. David Ricks was, I think, 40-something years old at the time. Jesse Norris was still a junior, 23 years old, I believe he was at that point. And it came down to that very last deadlift. Jesse Norris having missed a few lifts on that day and David Ricks having a good day, Jesse Norris had to pull that 350. I believe he pulled it on his second and got red lighted for, I don't know whether it was lockout or hitching or whatever it was, and he had to come in and pull on his third and get the win. But he did. he ended up getting the win, and this would have punched his ticket to 2017 Worlds. However, unfortunately, that is where the injuries compounded and he ended up retiring from the sport. That performance at 2016 USAPL Nats was the last time we saw Jesse Norris compete. He was only 23 years old, so he was still a junior, believe it or not. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, he had that shoulder injury which severely plagued his bench press. But aside from that, he also got a pretty bad lower back injury. He talked about in some of his YouTube videos that he had no space left between his discs in his lower back. So unfortunately, he did not go to 2017 Worlds. He decided that he didn't want to go when he was not at his best. And he also pulled out of a bunch of untested meets that he was going to do to further extend his world record on the untested side. However, he pulled out of those as well because, again, he wanted to be at his best, which was fair enough. There were a few rumors about his comeback floating around in the years since, but unfortunately those never materialized, and we have never seen Jesse Norris back on the platform. And he has since wiped pretty much all his presence off social media. His YouTube channel remains up, but he hasn't posted a video in a lot of years now. And that screenshot is actually from one of the most recent videos he did post. I think it was from his last or second last ever video, talking about his training update and his injuries. But he deleted his Instagram and never returned to powerlifting, it seemed. Okay, so let's look at when his records finally fell. So on the untested side, it was almost 6 years later when his record was broken by none other than John Hack. So John Hack, this was done in, I believe this was 2020, almost 6 years after Jesse Norris set the record in 2014. And in some ways, he was kind of the John Hack before John Hack became John Hack, because he, started his career in the IPF. Granted, he was lifting equipped as a sub junior, but still. And then he took records in the tested and in the untested. John Hack obviously was world champion in 2016 as an 83. Then he bulked up, crossed over to the untested side, and took this record off of Jesse Norris, beating it by 10 kilos, 932.5. Then it took quite a few years beyond that for his tested record to finally fall. So Juwan Garrison, just last year, 9.5 years after Jesse Norris's legendary 914, finally broke it by a single kilo with 915. He was also the first 93 to out squat him with a 355 kilo squat. Now Juwan Garrison, this in itself is somewhat controversial because Juwan was another lifter who lifted in and out of the untested, lifting, sometimes in the USPA, sometimes at the American Pro and the Ghost Clash, and sometimes in USAPL meets. Obviously, this one was done at a USAPL meet, hence it counted as a tested overall world record because it was done under tested conditions, just not internationally at the IPF, obviously. And he was going to, after this, cross over to Powerlifting America to compete at the IPF, because at this point in time, only Gavin Aiden had crossed 900 in the IPF with 901, so it looked like he was the strongest 93. However, unfortunately, he got banned due to declaring to the use of peptides. And being in his late 30s, he decided, screw it, he's not going to wait for his ban, and I think he's still lifting in the untested now. So that's a bit of a shame. But yeah, it took almost a decade for Jesse Norris's record to get beaten by a tested 93 lifter. Also, Juwan Garrison was also only 90 kilos here, which is pretty crazy. Then the record finally fell in the IPF. So because of some of the controversies around Juwan Garrison, some people still, didn't believe it, but somewhat thought that the record needed to be broken in the IPF in order for it to truly be considered broken. And Gustav did just that. At Sheffield this year, he became the first person in the IPF to officially beat Jesse Norris's best number. And again, he did it by a single kilo, totaling 915. This was an IPF world record at the time when he did it, and was enough to get him third place at Sheffield for a back-to-back Sheffield podium. Obviously, this did not count for the overall world record because Juwan had hit 915 earlier. And this also would not last very long as the IPF world record, because the other 93 who was at Sheffield that year was Emil Krastev, who actually beat Gustav with 917.5. And this was enough to get Emil Krastev also onto the Sheffield podium in second place and set a new IPF world record, which still stands today, 917.5. and that is also the overall world record. So this is the first time since 2014 that the strongest 93 kilo lifter, or the overall 93 kilo world record holder, is the same as the IPF world record holder. Throughout all those years, the IPF world record was a lot lower than Jesse Norris's 914, and it was only over a decade later in 2025 when the IPF world record finally caught up. And Emil Krastev went on to win Worlds recently as well. But there you have it. That is the unfortunate story of Jesse Norris, who, despite being the first outlier of powerlifting, so much stronger than his peers, someone that it took literally the rest of the world a decade to catch up to him. It took a decade for any 93 tested lifter to come close to what he ended up doing. He unfortunately missed out on opportunities to compete at IPF Worlds as a raw lifter due to either failing the test or due to injuries. And unfortunately, the injuries just compounded and became too much, and he ended up leaving the sport. And even though he left the sport while still a junior at just 23 years old, his legacy will last for a long time.